where did Dzogchen come from? Now, there are 4 stories of how Dzogchen developed and was brought into the world. Now, the first one's a little bit fantastic, but I have to get it out of the way because some people actually think this is how Dzogchen actually came about in the first place. And though it's a fantastic idea, it's a wonderful idea, I'm not sure if there's a lot of truth to it. But the first idea is that the actual teachings came from the Buddha, right? They came from Gautama the Buddha, Siddhartha Gautama. And in the Dzogchen teachings, he kept for his inner sanctum. Now, a lot of people do believe this, right? That he kept this for the inner sanctum. And then it was passed down to Nalanda University to the great scholar sage Nagarjuna, right? Who was considered the second Buddha. And then the teachings of Dzogchen traveled from Nalanda University in Bihar in India all the way to Odiyana, which is kind of northern Pakistan. It was called Odiyana at the time. And so, which would be considered Bharat, in its totality, right? It would be considered ancient India. And so it apparently traveled to Odiyana, and then it found the sage Garab Dorje. And then Garab Dorje passed down the teachings to Padmasambhava, Guru Rinpoche, if you will. And then Padmasambhava took the teachings into Tibet, right? And so this is a fantastic idea. It's a lovely story. It kind of reminds me of the Journey to the West, these type of mythologized stories of actually real sages, but then there's a lot of fiction that's added around it. Now, though this is an extraordinary story, it's not commonly accepted in the world. Now, the second story of how Dzogchen was developed was through the 12 Dzogchen Buddhas, who were considered the 12 Dzogchen Buddhas. Now, these Buddhas are more like deities rather than actual people. And they all represent an age of the universe, actually, an age of the universe. And they are passed down. And the 12th Dzogchen Buddha was actually Siddhartha Gautama, was Shakyamuni Buddha, right? The actual Buddha of our age. And so that again is another extraordinary, fantastic story. It's not highly considered amongst Vajrayanans and Mahayanans, but it's still a story that's out there nevertheless. It's an interpretation of how Dzogchen developed was through these deities down to the Buddha. Now we get to the last 2 stories and lineages of how Dzogchen developed, which are both considered true because we're looking at it from the Nyingma tradition, which is the old school of Vajrayana Buddhism, Tibetan Buddhism, or the ancient school. It's the oldest of the 4 schools in Vajrayana Buddhism. And then we have the Bon tradition, which is indigenous to Tibet, right? We have to remember that Vajrayana Buddhism came from India, came from Odiyana, and through Padmasambhava. Padmasambhava brought Buddhism to Tibet. That's why Padmasambhava is highly venerated in Tibet and the Vajrayana tradition. And as I said, his other name is Guru Rinpoche, right? The initial guru. And so what we're going to see in these 2 stories is 2 different interpretations from the Nyingma tradition of Vajrayana Buddhism and the Bon tradition of Tibet. So according to the Nyingma tradition, it traces its roots to a real person called Garab Dorje. Remember, I mentioned Garab Dorje just before in the first story because Garab Dorje was a sage scholar in Odiyana, right? And so according to the Nyingma tradition, it traces its Dzogchen roots to the first Buddha, Samantabhadra, to the real-life sage Garab Dorje. Now, before we get to Garab Dorje, who I mentioned previously, who is the first Buddha, Samantabhadra? So Samantabhadra is considered as the Adi Buddha. And so the Adi Buddha is the first or the primordial Buddha in the Nyingma and Bon traditions. But Samantabhadra is not referring to an actual person, but rather an innate wisdom present in all sentient beings. And this idea of Samantabhadra explains a higher teaching of 2 terms, which I'll explain later. But what it does explain is the relationship between the Dhammadhatu and the Dhammakaya. But I'll explain these two terms later, and you'll understand then what that means in relation to Samantabhadra. So when we talk about Samantabhadra or Adi Buddha, it is actually a metaphor of our true condition. Not a person, but a metaphor of our true condition. Because from the beginning, the state of the individual is pure and always remains pure. And so this is actually what Samantabhadra represents. But when we fall into conditioning, it is as if we are no longer Samantabhadra because we are ignorant of our true nature. And so that's kind of who Samantabhadra is, right? It's not a person, but rather it's a metaphor indicating or representing that innate wisdom or that ultimate reality in a lot of sense. But that was passed down from Samantabhadra, according to the Nyingma tradition, to the sage Garab Dorje. So you can think of this in the sense of how the initial rishis had the revelation of the Vedas, right? It's the same here in the story that Garab Dorje has had the revelation from the Adi Buddha, from the Samantabhadra, and then that's how Dzogchen came to him. And so you're probably asking, who is Garab Dorje? Because I mentioned Garab Dorje in the first story, remember? When I said that the teachings may have went from Nagarjuna and Nalanda University to Odiyana to Garab Dorje, and Garab Dorje passed on the teachings to Padmasambhava. And there's a little bit of truth there, a little bit of truth to that. But Garab Dorje was basically the first human to teach Dzogchen. Now, this is pretty much accepted in the Vajrayana tradition, right? In the Nyingma tradition, the old school tradition of Vajrayana Buddhism. This is pretty much the accepted notion that he was the first teacher. And then he transmitted the profound empowerments of Dzogchen to his chief disciple, Manjushri Mitra, and also to Padmasambhava. Now, the interesting thing here in this story is Manjushri Mitra was actually a profound Yogacara scholar at Nalanda University. He was part of the Yogacara school of Buddhism, and he was a profound teacher in Nalanda. And so did he learn from Garab Dorje and then move down to Nalanda? A lot of reports say that Manjushri Mitra was actually born not so far from Bodh Gaya in Bihar. And so maybe he traveled to Odiyana and then came back, or maybe he was at Nalanda first and then went to Odiyana. I'm only speculating, and we don't really know, but it is considered that Manjushri Mitra and Padmasambhava were the disciples of Garab Dorje. And obviously we know the story of Padmasambhava, as I mentioned previously, where Padmasambhava then traveled into Tibet. Right? And I've been up through all of the areas, particularly in Ladakh and northern India, where they say that Padmasambhava meditated in certain caves and this and that. And I've actually personally meditated in those caves as well. I found some of these places. But it's interesting when you trace the journey of Padmasambhava into Tibet, you actually find a lot of these significant places indicating that Padmasambhava was an actual real person. Some people don't believe Padmasambhava was a real person. But we have this story that's kind of accepted in the Nyingma tradition that Garab Dorje taught Padmasambhava, and then Padmasambhava took the teachings of Dzogchen into Tibet. But that is not the last story of how Dzogchen developed. Now, as I mentioned, we have the Nyingma interpretation, and we also have the Bon interpretation. So I'll ask you this question. Did Padmasambhava bring Dzogchen to Tibet, or was Dzogchen already there? Now, the reason I ask that is because the fourth interpretation is that Dzogchen originated in the Bon tradition, the indigenous tradition of Tibet, through its founder, Tonpa Shenrab Miwachi, who lived apparently 18,000 years ago. So obviously Tonpa predates the actual Buddha, predates Garab Dorje, predates Buddhism in general, right? And in the Bon tradition, this is actually accepted that Tonpa Shenrab Miwachi actually lived 18,000 years ago and was the first Dzogchen master. Dzogchen came from Tonpa. That is the interpretation of the Bon tradition. Now, those last two, right, the Nyingma tradition and the Bon, I'll leave that up to you, to whichever one you think is real and where Dzogchen came from. Or maybe they both arose in both traditions and then just met each other in Tibet. There is that possibility as well. So I wanted to lay that sort of history out to you before we get to the actual teaching. Sometimes you actually need some context to grow a greater affinity for the tradition. And I found this all throughout my life. So I like to, a lot of the time, explain the history because it connects you to those lineages and it connects you to that time and place.